Secondly, we tell you that power delegation already exists in the status quo. And when we say this, we mean that when the central government passes education or healthcare policy, right, they still delegate power to the state government in order to execute this policy. Therefore, what we do is we remove this crucial barrier and we allow the state government to directly take control. Before I move on to my second premise, I will take a POI, preferably from closing.
Okay, but this is a very low burden that you're taking. Actual federal countries that are decentralized, like Canada or Australia, provinces and states have ultimate power when it comes to legislation and policy making. Adding a federal veto basically undercuts your case.
Okay, if state governments have the ultimate power, we don't know why a federal government will exist in the first place. We still think that the federal government will have responsibility. I don't know what you're trying to push there. All right, then. Second premise about the incentive analysis for state governments, right? Panel, we still know that democracy works in states, right? What does this mean? This means that government power structures still have an incentive to maintain their position. Now let's do a comparative analysis of state and central governments, right? We tell you when state governments have an incentive to maintain their power, they have an incentive to keep the people of the state happy. This is to say that if you are the central government, you are contesting elections on things such as countrywide policy, like one state is just another state for you. Even if you lose the elections and like in that state and you win the majority, you still win the elections. This is not how it works in state governments, which is why we believe that the state governments uniquely bear the incentive of actually delivering the best policy to their citizens, right? Thirdly, then, on why we get more accuracy, right? Two things, right? Firstly, we tell you because you have less layers of policy making. That means that you less layers from legislation to execution. What does that mean? That means that you will not overcut your budget, you will not undercut your budget. Not a lot of money will actually be lost in things like corruption, right? That means to say that you will have better fund usage when it actually matters, right? You will actually invest that money into building hospitals. You will actually invest that money into building schools. It won't lose itself in the delegation of power from the center to the state. Um, Fourthly, then, we tell you that scrutiny is direct in our, right? Because look, it's very easy for people of a state to protest against the state government, right? It's very easy for backlash in a state to actually happen against the state government. We tell you at the point at which you backlash against the central government, you need unification, right? You need all of that. And we say, therefore, that because your scrutiny is direct, at the point at which, even in our world, if the state government passes bad policy, you will have the scrutiny of that policy, you will have a higher likelihood of rectification, right? On
Yeah,
the
why?
comparative, in their world, I'll take you in a moment. If the central government actually passes the policy and that policy is not well met by the people, if scrutiny exists, scrutiny will not exist to the same extent, and the likelihood of rectification will reduce. I'll take your point.
Do you think it's likely that states and the federal government will use each other as a foil and basically like say that, oh, we're being protested at the state level, we can't implement this policy. The federal government will say they're the ones imposing, like, how do you deal with this kind of disagreements that exist?
We told you in our policy that if disagreements exist, then the federal law will prevail. But okay, fine. Even if scrutiny exists and like the central government takes heed of it, right? We tell you that fine, there will be some level of interventionism, but at the point at which state governments are actually scared of that scrutiny, they will probably think about all of that, right? They will think about backlash to a far greater extent. Secondly, we talk about elections, right? For central governments, we tell you that you have a lot of responsibilities, right? You are not just passing policy for one state, you are passing policies for all of the states in Malaysia. That should say crucially that when you're passing tailor-made state policies, you are probably thinking about things like elections, right? You will have policies passed closer to elections. On the comparative, because the state government is scared of things like scrutiny at all times, the state government will actually pass policies throughout their tenure. Thank you. And for all of these reasons, this debate has never been clearer opening up.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. Calling to the stand the Leader of Opposition. You're here.
Hi, just give me a moment to prepare my timer.
Leader of Opposition, you're a bit muffled on my end. Can you please fix your mic?
Can you hear me better at this volume?
Okay, yes.
Okay, I'll be beginning my speech in 3, 2, 1. Side government tells you a lot of things, but what they actually do not tell you is the fact that the federal government can be just as efficient as the state government when run for. Here's why. They think that the federal government is inefficient, but in fact, I think that is actually the opposite that is true, which I'll unpack a little bit more in my substantive. But here's why their characterization is already untrue. Firstly, their characterization that the state governments are more likely to be able to be incentivized to help people on the ground. I think that this is like fundamentally something that would be very symmetric on our side of the house as well, considering the fact that the federal government would actually be incentivized against civil unrest on a countrywide scale. Not to mention the fact that their whole idea of like more scrutiny also does not work because of the fact that it's precisely because when people are actually like angry at the federal government as a whole, when there's a critical mass across the nation where this civil unrest is actually more powerful versus in a state within just one state, there would likely be some people who are angry, but we think that there's likely not enough people for there to be a critical mass against the state government themselves, and the state government can quite easily kind of stamp that down without the rest of the nation taking awareness of this injustice, no thank you, and coming to their aid. And it's for this reason we think that the state government is not necessarily better than the federal government. But secondly, to rebut their point on how they actually provide some sort of like check and balances, I feel as if like they didn't really provide a mechanism to this, where like the federal and the local governments will not clash. They basically, their whole point was like they're going to remove the exclusive right for the local governments to also access the resources from the federalists and then distribute these resources. But they never actually provided us a mechanism on how the federal government as well as the local government are going to come together and come to a consensus on how to handle this out. I think this is going to probably cause some friction between the states, especially when there's going to be a consistent clashing should this become a long-term policy, and would eventually fracture the different states and maybe cause some disunity between different states or different people who are fighting over resources. Okay, thirdly, their whole point on how state or local government is going to have like a better understanding because they have access to crucial healthcare data. I think it's not true. The federal government actually receives a lot of the health data or whatsoever data from the local governments before they make their decisions. And in fact, should this be a problem, we can just simply modify the federal government's way of procedure by actually like, I don't know, having like yearly reports on like from each state on how they felt the resources were distributed, and that's how the federal government can vary their distribution from there on. Okay, but now on to my first substantive on why actually having the federal government control the federal list will lead to more nation building. So for some context on like Malaysia, obviously within Malaysia, it's not just like one homogeneous state. There's multiple cultural identities and in fact disparate cultural identities from historical or ethnic geographical like lines caused by colonization. So things like between like Sarawak, Sabah, and like the general like original Malay state. And we think that because of this, there's always been a lot of tension, especially maybe also between like Malay and like Chinese immigrants. And we think that the federal list is actually an extremely important tool in terms of combating this sort of tension within society. So how does this happen? Because the federal list governs things like education and hospital and standardizes things like curriculum, this actually provides common touchstones to dissolve ethnic lines because different people from different states are all going through the same systems. They're having similar experiences, learning the same subjects, learning how to interpret the world the same way. We see that education is extremely important because of three reasons. A, because education is the first point of which where you learn to actually see the world. It molds your perspective on the world. And secondly, because education is also where you learn your impression of your own nation. So that teaches you not just how you like interpret the world in terms of skills, but also like the common facts that underlie your reality. And like thirdly, like it's just a very formative place for you. That's where you spend most of your time. That's like where you like gain most of your memories. That's when you gain experiences to connect with other people. This is why like if I'm in, let's say I'm in one state of Malaysia and I'm going through an education and I go through like the same like curriculum on like mathematics, and then I meet someone else from the next state over, and I can just be like, oh my gosh, that mathematics segment was so difficult, right? And we can bond over that. So we feel like this is just a very common point where people used to form sort of like unity and experiences and bond with each other. And that's actually something that helps people to actually feel like a collective whole in a state, which actually heals the disunity that comes previously. So why is this national unity kind of so important and so good? We think it's because like firstly on a micro scale, it helps you feel connected with your neighbors and it changes your view of like everyday life. So for example, if I feel like united with my nation, I'm more likely to identify with the goals of my nation. So I'm more likely to identify with the goals of Malaysia. So for example, mundane tasks like working in an office job, in a minute, could actually like be very fulfilling for me now, because now I'm thinking like, no, I'm not just entering this data into the spreadsheet. I'm entering this data into the spreadsheet for the sake of my job to do well, so that I can actually help like the rest of the nation and like the people around me. Basically, it tunes you into the fact of your national contribution, and we think that this is also likely to get out in more like emotional happiness. You just feel it's a place here. You feel like you have a purpose. But now I think that you are.
Wait, so you're saying if the federal government passes policy, that's somehow going to increase the national unity?
I'm saying that the federal government working on providing a standardized curriculum, in, for example, education to the whole of the nation, is going to allow people to have share common experiences. Okay, but it's exactly because of this sort of like emotional happiness or fulfillment of perspective that there's going to be more national prosperity, because of like firstly, it's going to prevent tensions or riots. So, for example, like if we look towards like a comparative like Indonesia, that's probably where like the state governments were in charge of like each of their education systems, and that resulted in a lot of like tensions or riots because it just emphasized ethnic lines or ethnic enclaves. Secondly, also this national prosperity, I feel like people are going to be more committed to the nation and they're working harder. Like for example, Japan, they're actually collectivized, and that's how you actually get great economic growth that allows you to gain benefits, such as like I don't know, more wealth that like people can spend in their daily lives, more disposable income, things like that. That just generally make people happier. And we think that on a like a huge like scale term, there's like a huge impact. The whole nation benefits rather than, for example, a state government. If one state government is shoddy and so on and so forth, they aren't going to get any of these benefits. And in fact, can even separate in terms of like let's say their economic differences, it separates them even more. It emphasizes differences. Now, finally, very quickly on the efficiency of this federal list, we think that the fact that the federal list is based in one system and then executed by each state gives each state time to fine tune the actual like plans from the federal government. So by standardizing all like the plans on how the curriculum, how the healthcare is going to go, all these states are able to actually apply whatever plans, focus on applying those plans successfully rather than coming up plans on your own. We think that this way the states can specialize their staff, and that way they're going to be just maximizing their resources better. The staff can use their resources more efficiently to actually pursue success on the ground for the people of the nation, and that's how the actual people within the state are going to benefit. And it's for this reason that we think that the federalist actually maximizes resources, especially considering the fact that resources like healthcare and education are things that need not be like customized to each person. It's a very one size fits all. Even within a state, there's like thousands of people within one state. You still have to customize that. So for all these reasons, please vote for the side of the house that best prioritizes the citizens' needs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leader of Opposition. Calling to the stand, Deputy Prime Minister, here.
Am I audible and visible?
Yes, you're audible and visible.
Cool. I don't buy the fact that the moment everybody's educational policy is actually the same, the curriculum they're studying is the same, you'll suddenly get a new era of increased national unity and sudden prosperity within our country. We don't think that the actual change you'll get on their side is as large as they make it out to be in that sense of national unity. There's a couple of reasons why. right? Even if you have differing educational policies between states, we tell you that it's actually more responsive to the needs and like the understanding of people's experiences in the areas that they live in. We tell you that people's experiences nationwide are not the same, and it is not beneficial to have educational policy that is the same across the nation. We tell you things like how hard economics is probably going to be similar statewide. We tell you that the federal government does have some sort of like influence in the curriculums of the state. Things like educational funding will go to things that the federal government supports in that sense. And state policies won't be like wildly different. But then the examples where this like educational policy really, really comes into play is more in things such as if there are states with more indigenous population or things like that, or specific cultures that they want to preserve, they will have increased policies in that sense to be able to preserve those cultures more. We tell you that those differences will only be made possible by the understanding that a state level government has compared to a federal level government. We tell you that the shared unity or achieved somehow by similar educational policy, which we don't get how that happens really based on like bonding on how difficult your economics class is. We tell you that you won't actually get as much change as they tell you,
Point of
but
information.
also it's outweighed by the benefits. I'll take you in a bit. It's outweighed by the benefits that we give you on our side, because if educational policy is tailor made, if it actually fits the people's needs and their experiences more, allows them to preserve cultures that are predominant in the area of the state, things like that, those are actually better for people's experiences compared to a standardized sort of educational policy that you're talking about, actually not bringing more benefit. I don't see how it's feasible to expect everybody to have the same educational needs throughout an entire country. That is a very large landmass. That is also a very diverse group of people. And we think that it's actually not feasible to have an educational policy that meets everybody's needs without the understanding of the state government that actually tell them what that educational policy should be tailored to and actually help their experience be better than if it was completely standardized. Before I move on, I'll take your point.
Do you think that the state government is going to be run by the minorities with the sensitivities to actually implement these educational policies, or by the majorities who are blind to them?
We think that that is probably going to be inexclusive to our side. If you tell us that the state governments are run by the majority that are blind to the minorities within the country, we tell you that your federal government will also be run by the majority that is blind to the minorities. We tell you that you will also still not get the same levels of national unity if your government ignores minority experiences. We tell you the same reason the federal government has incentive to actually talk about like minority states. State governments do to the minorities within their state, specifically things like that. We think that it's more beneficial, more tailored to their experience, because if you have a curriculum that fosters national unity on the federal level, we tell you that actually fosters a better educational experience at the state level, because they still have to contend with with the minorities within their state, because they have an incentive to get like voted back in. I don't see why it's so hard for them to implement these specific policies when they have so many people familiar with the experiences within that state. We tell you that they do have an incentive to actually like help with minority experiences, the same one the federal governments do, but then the degree is that it is tailor made more in that sense. You gave us a rebuttal on our point about like it being easier to protest against state governments, as there aren't enough people to form a critical mass of to be able to actually get any change within the country. We tell you that it's actually not true. The critical mass required to make change on like a state level, we tell you is actually going to be lower than one required on a federal level, and the amount of like degrees separating the policymakers and the people on the ground are comparatively less compared to like a centralized federalized lawmaking system. And we think that it's actually beneficial. We think less people are required, and we think states are more responsive to individual state needs. Educational policy will be more responsive if everybody has an issue within the state. We tell you that it's more responsive. I'll take you in a bit. It's actually more responsive compared to the amount of people needed for a general federalized education or healthcare policy. I'll take your point.
So maybe in your best case scenario, states do have better interests, but unfortunately, many states are simply a lot poorer and a lot more disadvantaged than others. So how are they able to actually execute economically on these interests when it comes to these specific industries in your world?
We think that even if you have things like federal laws, there's still federal funding that exists that is required to go to these states. Like we told you earlier, you're not going to get state policies that are like wildly different and unconstitutional. We told you there was like a way, there were checks and balances still in place as laws for things like unconstitutional, and federal funding still exists. So they're not gonna have laws that are completely like out of whack, things like that. And we tell you that federal funding still exists. I don't see why funding really is an issue. There are other ways to get funding, and if states don't have funding for projects, probably important enough that the federal government will give them some money to do things like they do right now. I don't see like states needing to bring up like funding in the current like, status quo right now to execute any policies that they may have there, especially on a wider scale. I think there would be requirements for funding to exist. I don't really buy that being a super big issue. Continuing what I said upon like the federal veto, you guys said that it's okay, the federal government can just say no to any law. That is not what we said in our speech. More so, we said that if it's unconstitutional, states can't really make laws. They're just completely different. Like I said earlier, we tell you that they'll still be within reason. There's still frameworks that they have to abide by. The difference here is that it's not exclusive to federal lawmaking, that they have to make laws about topics like this. Just rebuilding a bit on my teammate's point earlier on actually like on how efficient it is. Basically, to have state-made policy, we tell you that even if the federal government has the best interest in mind to get like voted back into power, they won't have sufficient understanding of the things that go on in other states. We tell you that they don't have enough people on the ground to have this understanding. We tell you the politicians within legislative bodies are not sufficient to actually create laws that actually are tailor-made to the healthcare requirements, the security requirements, the educational and subjective life experiences present within like different geographical areas. And honestly, centralized power in this sense is actually more inefficient for the country. It's less responsive, and we don't see why any of the benefits they brought up primarily on national unity actually stand within this debate, purely because A, it's not as big as they make it out to be. B, we still win on intensity because we help these minority
Time.
people more and it's more responsive. For all these reasons, never been prouder to propose. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy Prime Minister. To close the opening half, calling to the stand, Deputy Leader of Opposition, here.
Hey, can I check I'm visible and audible?
Yes, you are visible and audible.
Alright, is this volume okay?
Yep, perfect.
Okay, great. I'll take my POIs verbally. Thank you. I think OG loses this debate at the point at which their metrics for why the local government is necessarily better than a federal one are symmetric at best. One key rebuttal for the House today. Now, their key proof for why a local state is better is that they have a better ability to understand the needs of individual states and thus create better policies. Two layers of response to this. One, we don't think the federal government has no ability to understand the needs of their people. We don't think they're completely divorced from the needs of individual states. At the point at which you have representatives in the federal government from each state that are able to have input, that are able to come to policies that likely apply to each state and are generalizable across every single state. The second layer of response to this then is that we think that federal governments are just able to create better policies because they have more resources. And this is also responsive to that point on why the federal government is overloaded and therefore inefficient. We think the fact that the federal government has unique access and control over the state's budgets and things like reserve funds means that they are able to do things like conduct research studies, for example, and that lead to better, well thought out policies. We think the comparative here is that the state government has far lower funds, so they don't have the ability to put as much thought and as much resources into developing their policies. They also can't take advantage of things like economies of scale as compared to the federal government, which just needs to develop one generalizable policy. We think it's far harder for local governments to do this at the point at which they don't have as much access to resources then. But moving on then to weighing my LO's material, because I think that like opening gov has just ignored this. 2 points are weighing here. Firstly, why are shared experiences so important for national unity, and why do we get this better on outside the house, right? We've explained to you why the framing of Malaysia is that they have many disparate cultural groups, and why there's a necessity to create shared experiences for these cultural groups. We think the unique mechanism on our side is that we're able to get people go through things like similar educational experiences. Oh, thank you. Similar educational experiences. This means that they have things like shared history curriculums. They have similar understandings of how their country like came to be. They have similar understandings of what their country looks like. I think it's particularly important at the point which you're able to dissolve these hard ethnic lines between all these disparate cultural groups. And I think the parallel here is probably China, right? We think there's a lot of different ethnic groups in China, but they don't see themselves as these individual ethnic groups. They all see themselves as Chinese, and this is because the Chinese government treats them as a collective, so they start to perceive themselves as a collective as well. We think this doesn't happen on your side of the house. At the point which you have individualized education curriculums, people have different understanding of their own country's history. We think at that point they have no common touchstones to be able to dissolve these national lines and be able to operate as like under one united country. And now I'm going to engage on like ops framing here about like preserving indigenous cultures. The first response to this is what my LO said in her PM. We think this is like symmetric on both ends. We don't think it's a particularly good mechanism for you to say, oh, but local governments need minorities to vote that means so they're likely to care about that more. We think whether it's a local or federal government, these minorities still don't have the critical mass. At best, this is symmetric on both sides. But furthermore, on preserving indigenous cultures, we don't think we lose this on our side of the house at the point which people are still living within these cultures. They have the lived experiences. They still see their like grandparents are very connected to these cultures. We don't think this is necessarily lost at the point at which you have a generalized educational curriculum because you still have access to these cultures in your everyday life. We don't think this is a harm that you can push on our side of the house then. But moving on then to like my
POI?
second, no, thank you, on efficiency. We think standardization leads to more efficiency. And here's where we're going to talk about the specific mechanisms of the federal list. We think things like having a standardized military, for example, means that you're able to have joint trainings, means that you're able to have a standing army that knows each other's like protocols and regulations very well, that are able to work together and like generally leads to a more efficient standing army. The second point here on like why education is standardized. The second reason why this is important, beyond like giving people shared experiences, is that it enables people to transfer between states in response to economic ebbs and flows, right? So it looks like things like people being able to move to a different state when urbanization occurs and there's more job opportunities in that state because they went through the same education system, because they are able to operate within the confines of that state rather than being restricted to their own state and being simply unable to operate in other states because they have gone through a different education system. They don't have the qualifications necessary. We think this is what exists on your side.
POI?
This is what restricts people and restricts the country as a whole from developing when people are unable to respond to specific demands. Before I move on to my extension, I'll take a POI.
We have empirical evidence of things like federal policies and education being bad. There being a significant disconnect. How then do you like contend with the fact that the disconnect is actually greater on your side with federal policy, less tailored, and the fact that we do have
Look, I don't think you can say we have empirical evidence and take that as like a response to us, right? We think we've already proven to you why federal governments are able to be connected to local people insofar as the representatives in the federal government come from these individual states. We don't see why that point stands, and we don't think like having empirical evidence is a particularly good response. Moving on to my extension then on long-term prosperity. So uniquely, we think that the federal government is different from the local government for two mechanisms. The first is that we think they have a macro view of what to trade off in the long term, right? Because they're looking towards building the nation as a whole. The comparative here is that your local government is focused on improving the immediate quality of life. They're focused on getting immediate results because they need it for votes. So I think the intuition pump here is that like your state has $1 billion, right? Usually this is like split between various territories and like states, because they have these very limited resources, they take like 1/10 of this $1 billion. They do things like they build some roads, they build some businesses. Now I think this maybe has some effects on people's immediate quality of life, but we think the federal government is unique at the point in which they can choose not to split these resources and sink them into different things like building certain roads and highways. We think they can choose to take this $1 billion and sink it into building large-scale projects like airports and ports. So we think in the short term, even if people have to give up improvements to their immediate environment, this leads to long-term huge gains that you don't get on the side of the local government when all your resources are split between an infinite number of states. And we think this looks like things like having the ability to pool natural resources, right? Having the ability to take their natural resources and put it into one large-scale project rather than it being like infinitely traded between states. Second mechanism here on like funding, I think we've already talked about this in our rebuttals, but I think the fact that the federal government has access to things like the entirety of the state budget and has access to things like reserve funds, as opposed to local governments that only have access to like whatever they can get from their income taxes, we think the federal government just has far more ability to do these sort of large-scale projects. And the comparative here then is also on economies of scale, right? We think the fact that the federal government can implement policies that are like going to be standardized across Malaysia means that they get economies of scale. The unit cost becomes far lower at the point at which they are able to expand this across a larger scale as compared to local governments that are operating within a very small scale. They have a far higher cost per unit for whatever they want to implement. But then why is this large-scale infrastructure so important, right? And I think the key piece of framing here is that Malaysia is a developing country, and we think the most important metric for them to be able to get out of this is their ability to engage with the global economy. Two mechanisms for this. Firstly, on why we change the position in the global chain of production. We think at the point in which you're able to build large-scale infrastructure that supports high-skilled labor and is able to produce high-value goods like semiconductors, you change your position in the global chain of production. You become like a key factor in the global chain of production as compared to the comparative when Malaysia is just currently seen as a center for like other developed countries to outsource their menial labor for them to put factories there because they don't have the infrastructure to support anything else. And we think we are also able to become a trading center at a point in which we can support huge imports. This looks like what happens in Singapore, right? Where you just become like the center of the global economy. Everything that happens has to go through there. And think what happens to people's lives when within 10 to 20 years, the federal government is able to build enough infrastructure to raise the GDP. There are massive impacts because people just go start having massive job opportunities. We think they are able to access a far better quality of life in the long term of outside the house. And that's why we win this debate, because we protect people's lives in the long term and lead to sustainable policies. Never been proud to oppose.
Thank you very much, Deputy Leader of Opposition. To start the closing half of the round, calling to the stand, Member of Government, here.
Can I be heard? Just checking.
Yes, you are audible.
Okay. Before I start, I prefer verbal PRIs. So yeah. Yeah, I'll start. Very simple speech for you today. First, I'm going to go into several responses against OO's case, and I'm going to go more into extensions and reframing the debate as a whole. Because I think both openings have kind of ignored the nuances that is needed in talking about Malaysia, right, in regards to race and etc. But before that, I'm going to go into responses, right? Because OO gave you a very utopian view of how the federal government treats people, right? That's one of the first things they told you is about how like, oh, there's a lot like politicians from like different states still provide representation, and like so that means that states will still be heard in some ways. But I think they fail to ignore that there's like big states and small states in Malaysia, right? States like Selangor or like states in like Malacca or like whatever have much more considerable influence compared to states like Perlis that's really small, or like states in like Sabah Sarawak. That is to say that smaller states are likely to be neglected by this like big in favor of bigger states, because big national parties are likely going to prioritize states with substantial voter base. This means that states with a lot of minorities or even with a small population are likely going to be overlooked in the interest of these big states, because these political parties only cares about these big states. That means that states like in Sabah Sarawak historically have no say over their own natural resources, because it's been constantly taken away by the federal government all the way in Putrajaya in order to basically build infrastructure project in KL, in Malacca, etc. Right? I think that goes at the neglect of a lot of minorities from in Sabah, in Penang, etc. I think then in terms of what they talk about how a federal government can nationalize the curriculum to basically reduce racial tensions or whatever. I think actually on that side of the house, I'll take it in a bit. It's actually going to worsen the experience of minorities, because they tell you that the federal government has historically focused on the Malay vote because they are the majority population in Malaysia, which in turn make the education much more Malay centric. The reason why this probably doesn't work in a state in Malaysia compared to a state like Japan, because Japan or like China is largely homogenous, where most people identify themselves as Chinese. But Malaysia is way different. Malaysia is a multicultural state with dozens of ethnicities, Indians, Chinese, Malays, etc. Right? I think in regards to that, and a lot of these states have different proportion of ethnicities, where states like Penang has like more Chinese people than states like Terengganu, where there's like of more Malay people. I think then you're unable to actually cater to this specific states and what their population needs as a whole, right? There's a reason why in the status quo, a lot of these minority schools are run by the community because they simply don't trust the federal government in giving them the education for their kids. I think that is the problem in OO's case, that they have failed to
POI.
the problem with. But before that, I'll take a POI.
What's the comparative on your side where minorities are both geographically and now culturally separated from the rest of the nation and you don't feel connected to the rest of the country?
I'll go into that. I'm literally going to my reframing, because I'm going to go more into extension and actually recognize what gospels look like, because I don't think OG does a very good job in this regard. Because in terms of education, right, I think states have better ability to cater to the needs of minorities, because states first can like look at the proportion of minorities and actually look at what these people actually want, because most of this like population is likely gonna, because the states governments are likely gonna have more accountability compared to a government on a national level, and this state's government have to actually listen to minorities more because they take out more of the voter base. I think then we think that they can cater more to minorities. I think our extension here is very different from OG, because they just went back to basically how state governments closer proximity, meaning serve citizens better. But we think because how state governments are likely going to have a bigger minority voter base, it means that they are forced to listen to them. I think then we give you mechanization on why it's likely to treat people like minorities better, because like the governments are likely going to care more about minorities and they're able to adapt their curriculum to that population. But that's to say that we still think there's going to be some sort of national standard in regards to how education will look like. So don't think minorities is going to fall behind compared to the rest of the country, even if that's the geographical problem, because we think that states still have the ability to do so themselves. I still think that federal government will still provide some sort of fund in providing this, such as the US system, where the US federal government still provides some sort of aid to certain states. I think it's going to be very similar in terms of the system. But I think in terms of other regards, such as the military, which OO gave a very brief analysis upon, we think it's gonna look like the US systems where like states have their own national guards, and in times of crisis, they're probably gonna have like this authorities cooperate with each other, which directly responds to OO's weird case about how like basically how uh about the military as a whole. But then I'm gonna go more into natural resources as a whole, right? Let's understand that there's a lot of states in Malaysia, such as like states in Borneo, like Sabah, Sarawak, have in our side of the world have more say over how the natural resources run. This means that they can actually invest the money that they make from these natural resources from oil into basically developing their economy more. Because in the status quo, a lot of this money that comes from oil in Borneo is taken away by the federal government into states in Peninsular Malaysia, into Selangor, etc. And most often than not, most of these resources doesn't go back into this to Borneo as a whole. Then here's what CG is gonna prove at the end here, right? Because they're going to tell you why the federal government has failed to basically tailor to states such as like Sabah, Sarawak, and why giving them more authority allows them to actually address this issue in the first place. And I'm going to go into the first argument on why it matters those people on the ground, right? Because I already told you why states government are prone to have more accountability from the people, because a larger voter base of minorities, because there's probably a different proportion of minorities in different states. And I also think that because people, I think state governments probably have like probably will have like a shorter term, which means that they probably have more elections, which means that probably prioritize the election by looking at like what other people want, what the people in their state wants as a whole, right? So I think minorities have greater say compared to a national system, because a large voter bloc is again part of the state election. So you can do things in terms of like how this create more nuance in terms of what minorities want to do with resources utilized, right? Because I think in the status quo, federal governments are less likely going to cater to like minorities, because they're likely to cater to a majority race such as Malays, like BN and PN, catering to Malay voters at the neglect of like minority voters. I think the comparative much better on the side of government compared to opposition. It's already 6. Then I'm going to tell you why the federal government consistently failed to cater to the needs of states. I'm going to go back to the thing on natural resources, right? But again, because Borneo is like rich in natural resources, and like maybe like states in Penang is like have their own like facilities in terms of like creating of like ports or whatever. I think the federal government has consistently failed to utilize these resources properly, and led to these states to stagnate in their economy. I think most of this money can actually be used themselves by the state government, because they actually have because I think they have a better idea of how to spend this money themselves, because they want to prioritize more on their people more, rather than like the idea of like giving it to people in other states. I think that way, I think the people who actually live and work in the states that pay their taxes to the authorities actually get some sort of return more compared to the state to the comparative on opposition. I think then you also have much better impact, because in terms of like healthcare and education, there's much more closer proximity, and you can engage with much more nuance better compared to like a federal government response, where you're likely going to cater on a national basis, and you are likely to ignore the nuances required in engaging in Malaysia, because Malaysia has a lot of minorities and a lot of ethnicities, and you need to treat them with nuance, and never be harder to propose.
Thank you very much, Member of Government. Calling to the stand the Member of Opposition. Here.
Hello, am I audible? Okay,
Loud and clear.
great. Okay. I want to first talk about my extension, which will really analyze what decentralization actually looks like. What are the outcomes going to be where actors have the best incentives, and then what is likely to happen? Because I think
Here.
Just confirming, am I visible and audible?
Yes, you are visible and audible.
All right, thank you very much. Starting speech in 3, verbal POI speech. Thank you. Starting speech in 3, 2, 1. As the only Malaysian among all houses within this debate, I have two things to say. The first is that I don't like my country. The second, less controversial thing that I would say is that the conception of reality within this debate has been a bit strange. That Malaysia is not the liberal democracy that everyone just assumes it is. That the federal government is made up of a bunch of idiots as well. That to not engage with how much the peninsula broke their MA63 agreement in terms of their national resources, how they never succeeded in the Sulu conflict with the Philippines. Like that Kuala Lumpur isn't a part of a state. It's federal territory. All of this, not engaged with anyone within this debate that was introduced in UG's speech, ultimately proves to you, ladies and gentlemen, that we should take the first in this round. We were the first ones in this debate to actually tell you how giving autonomy in the way that states decide their policies was actually principally justified and why it actually gave the benefits that were actually materialized in comparison to the opening government. Though I feel a bit pity towards opening government. They tried to sound smart in the way in which the status quo essentially worked. But I still really need to understand. I think most of that blame can be put towards the side of opposition. Like, I'm sorry, but to not understand the differences between a federal government and the power that state government have and the state government have similar to that of the United States is just completely dismissive, and I just don't know how it is that you just completely ignore that. Because there are several things that are required within a federal government that does essentially still operate, that they can still do essentially operate on. They sounded pretty vague when saying this opening government, but we're actually going to be a bit more specific. Like, for instance, the provision of the setting of things like treaties or diplomats, our international relations are still things that can't be specific towards a certain state government, but are things that the federal government still has power
POI.
in determining. I think the best case here is to just stick to what the Infoslide says, that currently there are things within the concurrent list. Thank you, opening government guys. That both the federal government and state government have essential power over. But the way in which we differ is that we're giving the autonomy for states to determine most of the way in which this works, ladies and gentlemen. So, for instance, within education, it's not necessarily the curriculum, but it could be the building of things like museums, things that are set in stone under our side, which actually educates the public on certain things that are required within the state itself in order for them to be able to understand each other. Because one really important characterization we need to note about the federal government within Malaysia is that they're ultimately very much Bumi Putra centric. Like, for instance, we have the UMNO party, which is like the Nazis of Southeast Asia, or even with the PKR party that has come up, ladies and gentlemen, they're still very much Bumi Putra centric with high amounts of affirmative action catered towards the majority Malay race, ladies and gentlemen. So likely, all of the things that opening opposition kind of talked about, which is that the Chinese people will feel as though they're able to belong because the federal government is somehow able to be less amount of racist, while acknowledging that in the parliament we have around 2 Chinese women. I don't know why is it that that's somehow going to work. Under our comparative, we believe that state governments itself are able to make sure that are able to make sure that we cater towards what's best towards our voter base, because we cater towards a smaller, more specialized amount of individuals and the more specialized amount of diversity, ladies and gentlemen. So we're able to cater towards it. UG explained this perfectly, that a lot of the time they're likely to cater towards large amount of states, which a lot of people essentially know, but not care about per list. Like, I feel sorry for the 7 people there who aren't able to essentially get amount of help that happens under the comparative in the status quo or within opposition's world. Under our comparative, ladies and gentlemen, we get to make sure that the states have the complete autonomy to do this. But before I move on to the issues within this debate, go ahead, anyone. I'll take closing.
Closing? Okay. So you say that if governments and the federal government is as, quote, incompetent as you say, why are state governments not filled with similar bad faith actors? And then why are these actors, both the federal government and the state, not likely to then scapegoat one another when it comes to policy making?
Okay, that was the same question we asked you guys. I don't know. Okay, yeah, I get it. you try to be a bit more exclusive under your world. I don't know how you get but you guys also get the same stuff as well. But the comparative here, ladies and gentlemen, is that they're smaller. We can tell them that, hey, you're not doing your job. We might vote you out. We want you to represent us as people. You have the power now. So they have the accountability in comparison to our federal government, which has a lot of other things to be catering towards, which has a lot of other things to care about. They're not going to listen to you when it comes to these sort of things. This already happened in status quo, bro. Like when you go and there's like a leaky pipe, you don't go to the federal government to report it. Like you go towards the people who are a bit smaller so that they can solve the problem. I don't know what this is about. But like you can, on our comparative, we actually get to make sure that state building does essentially happen, ladies and gentlemen. And it's something that, that's something that's essentially way better. And then the whole state blaming federal government thing that was bad, somehow you say, I don't know what that has anything to do with anything. But like, your world also has state blaming the federal government about certain bad things, so I don't know what this was all about. Now answering questions. Two things, questions I'm going to answer in this debate. Firstly, why is it that essentially allowing us to be able to give autonomy is essentially very good, ladies and gentlemen? Because we told you that on our comparative, that we make sure that the federal government isn't allowed to give the full power to dictate or to, control the way in which things like national resources are essentially set. Or we are actually, or for instance, we are actually allowing, for instance, how the Johor army has their own, how Johor has their own army to protect the Sultan, right? So like, we allow for all this to occur because we don't want the federal government to take full control over it. I think opposition kind of like said like, what happens then if there's something bad that happens? I don't know like if they ask that question, but even if, let's say something bad happens, we tell you that the mechanism was pretty simple. The federal government still exists, bro. Like, we can still go together and, go fight people. Like, it's not that the state are suddenly their own seceded own states, own governments and own countries. No, we're still under a country, ladies and gentlemen. We allow for the best amount of natural resources to be able to be allocated. We allow it so that states have the power to determine the way in which their natural resources are actually kept towards these individuals. We cater towards these minorities best under our world. Only under our world do we actually solve these questions, and we actually give proof towards it. Proud to propose. Propose.
Thank you very much, Government Whip. To close the round, calling the opposition whip, hear, hear.
Okay, can you see and hear me?
Yes, you are visible and audible.
Okay, thanks. So the largest problem that faces both OG and CG in this round is they have a mismatch of capacity and incentive reasoning. They might be able to argue that states that are on a smaller level generally have better incentives to be able to deal with some problems that they face. The largest issue here is they still haven't proved to us why these smaller states have the capacity to actually be able to address these issues in the first place. And CG themselves explained to us very clearly why this capacity is likely to be very limited, because lots of states have more minorities. Lots of states are very different in makeup of political alignment than the federal government. And what that means is that the federal government is far less likely to be able to do things like fund them, far less likely to be able to actually increase the capacity of these smaller states to actually implement these policies, implement this military, implement this education in the first place. And that was the very simple line of reasoning that won us this debate very clearly from closing opposition. So I'll do a few things very clearly in this speech. First, to explain to you why the incentives align far better under our side of the House. I'll explain the minority states actually fall into our side, engage with CG. Then I'll explain my way out over OO. Firstly, I think OG is correct that federal governments have large weaknesses when it comes to how they carry out policy. They explained a few things. Firstly, they don't have understanding. They don't care as much about these policies, or there is more corruption in the federal government. But then suddenly the comparative that OG tries to argue is that all these problems disappear as soon as the federal government has to fix these states. We say that the unfortunate reality is that many of these states just tend to be poor because of their geographical area. Many states, for example, don't have access to things like ports. There are just less teachers that live in those states. They're more rurally spread out, so they need more infrastructure. They need more funding if they were to actually be able to actually provide the same level of things like healthcare, education to the populations. Or there's states where there are political minorities within the larger country of Malaysia. So we say that federal governments fund these types of states for less in their world. And we say that that only focus on probably the largest and the most politically viable states in terms of their electoral capacity in the first place. Or at least, even if funding maintains itself, it doesn't increase into the future to engage with things like population increases or engage with things like populations moving around within Malaysia at our very, very, very worst case. So then 3 reasons why we actually get better political incentives on our side of the House. Firstly, because of very direct political accountability, because when there are political opposition in national legislature, that is when they're able to hold these types of bills accountable. When you have direct bills as to where hospitals or schools or military bases are going to get built, there's actually far more direct debate as to where these resources are allocated in the first place, not this time. Whereas the comparative is, you have very vague debates as to funding bills that are going to exist in the first place, where these funding bills just get attached to larger funding bills that the Malaysian government passes, where each state can have the same amount of funding, though as we've already proved, some states simply need more funding, for example, if they're in rural areas, for more people to be able to access these same types of services, where you have to be on, where under our side of the House, these types of policies have to be on political campaigns and platforms where there's far more direct voter accountability, whereas the comparative, again, it's far more likely they can actually be slipped under the rug. But secondly, I think very importantly, we have more direct media accountability on the federal government. Where the federal government fails, it is the failure of the federal government in the first place. Whereas the comparative is, and this is our third reason, there's far more direct placement of blame inside opposition, inside government's world, where when the provincial or state government fails, that is when the federal government can say, it was not a failure of us not giving them enough funding, it was a failure of them not actually carrying out that service correctly. Or when a provincial or when a state government fails, that is when they can blame the failure on not them not carrying out the service correctly, not them catering to enough minorities. Rather, they can say, there's not enough funding from the federal government, and that is why this failure has existed in the first place. Still, the only engagement we got to this idea was from CG Whip. CG Whip says, this is going to be not exclusive. This exists under either side of the House. But this very simply isn't true. You cannot scapegoat a more regional government when you, as the federal government, are the one who is literally responsible for the direct application and the direct implementation of the service in the first place. So no, it was never a symmetric reason. It was very, very critical to the actual logic and implementation of this policy in the first place. Before I go on, OG.
Okay, don't federal governments still maintain the incentive, because general elections will still exist, as well as the capacity to actually divert those funds, because they still get things like state revenue and central.
So yes, federal elections still exist under our side of the House, but those federal elections actually far more directly hold the government accountable to carry out these policies under our side of the House when they're the actors responsible for these policies, where under your side of the House, it is state governments who are responsible for the implementation of the policies. So sure, there can be some small amount of accountability for funding, but again, these states come from much more minority areas where they probably don't have as much direct political accountability. Whereas under yours, the House, this funding is just simply far more spread out. This political accountability is weighed less heavily. So you have to engage with this debate on a comparative. We get far more direct political accountability under ours of the House. Then to engage more directly with CJ. CJ says there's a bunch of smaller states that get neglected in our world, where they have less political power. But again, I think on our side of the House, on their side of the House, these problems still apply. But it's far easier for you to give less funding to these states, to demonize them, because when you have a state that is made more heavily of minorities, where the makeup of that state is a lot more of these political minorities with maybe different political views, that is when the direct federal government can demonize them again and say that they don't have to provide as much direct support to these groups in the first place. Whereas the comparative is, again, that you as the national government are responsible for the failure of these services in the first place. Where on our side of it, it's far harder for you to leave minorities on a national level, where it's far easier for you to exclude them on a state level on the comparative. Where even in their best outcome, and this is taking them on their very best case scenario, they still acknowledge that many states are unfortunately majoritarian of ethnic makeup. What that means is that in their world, all of the minorities to be able to access things like education have to move around to the couple states where they can gain the most amount of political power. Whereas under our side of the House, these minorities can collectivize on a much more federal level to actually be able to get some type of federal change, as opposed to having to move more specifically to its minority provinces to be able to get that form of political action in the first place. So then very, very directly, why do we weigh out over OO in this debate? And I think this is very, very clear. So OO has the same type of problem of capacity and incentive logic in this round. They prove that there is generally actually more capacity for federal governments to be able to do things like pool resources, like standardization of efficiency, but they don't actually prove to you why federal governments have greater incentives to do these things in the first place, which is where critically CO is able to fill in this logic. And also, CO is the only opposition team in this debate round that is able to engage with the comparative as to why states are critically harmful for the implementation of these policies in the first place. Whereas OO tries to focus on a purely positive case in this round as to why generally federal governments are able to do things like pool resources to a greater extent. Where I think very, very clearly under RS of the House, the delivery of policymaking was the most critical impact in this debate round. Even if for some nebulous reason and some smaller reasons, states and governments were in some areas better, some areas worse at policymaking, we told you very, very directly in the long term, devolution of power ultimately meant you were taking away power from those vulnerable states and those vulnerable stakeholders in this debate round who needed federal support and who needed to be able to hold the federal government accountable the most. And it's for those very clear reasons this debate goes to CO.
Thank you very much, Opposition Whip. You guys may now cross the House.
Thank you, everyone. It was a great debate.
Thank
You
you,
guys may
everyone.
leave the room. For my panel,
wonderful
let's
debate.
go to the Room 3 Discord channel. See you guys.